Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this pre-election evening. My name is Audrey Lichter, the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholars Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with over 700 organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual and ritual development. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adults, lay or professionally led. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is our founder and board president, who authored a best-selling book called Conspiracy U, a Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionism conspiracy theories from the left and the right political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book on Amazon, along with the accompanying curriculum at Amazon or at chaimitzvah.org for only $18. The curriculum has been taught to hundreds of college students and others. The curriculum was also recorded in a series by Dr. Andrew Pessin, one of our esteemed scholars. You will receive all this information in a follow-up email as well. The Scholars Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. Our featured scholar tonight, we welcome back Dr. Mia Bloom, who is an International Security Fellow at New America and a professor of Georgia State College. She speaks 8 languages and has authored 6 books on violent extremism, including Dying to Kill and Bombshell. Her most recent book, Veiled Threats, coming out in the winter of 2025, explores the diverse roles of women involved in jihad. Mia has had appointments at Cornell, Harvard, Princeton, and McGill, and serves on several counter-radicalization boards. She holds a PhD from Columbia University and advanced degrees from Georgetown and McGill. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Mia Bloom.
Thank you so much. And let me apologize in advance for my raspy throat. I've been singing Smelly Cat all day. So I'm going to share with you my slides. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. What I'll do is there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. And this is a little bit different. Last month on the anniversary of October 7th, we talked about the situation in Gaza and whether women were being believed. This is looking at it from a different perspective, looking at terrorism and the fact that women have been targeted for recruitment, but also many of the terrorist groups have used constructs of gender in order to recruit the men by making the argument that if women are fighting, then the men are just a lot less manly. And Audrey was kind enough to mention, these are my books. There's a theme, right, of terrorism. Veiled Threats is very much a follow-on from my book Bombshell about women and terrorism that I published in 2011. And what had happened was in the interim period, a lot of jihadi groups, either that didn't exist in 2010, 2011, when the first book came out, or they didn't use women yet. And so that's why I really wanted to have a follow-on. And the cover of the book, it's coming with Cornell University Press, but the cover is actually a woman from Chechnya. And to give you a sense that women in the jihad has, in many ways, it has metastasized. Originally, we had almost no women in these groups, and now we have almost no group without women. Now, just to sort of take a step back, when we look at the role that women have played in terrorism, women have been involved in terrorism since the very beginning. I remember at the beginning of ISIS, I was doing a lot of media, and whether it was after Charlie Hebdo or the attack against the kosher market, they would ask me, are you surprised that it's a woman? And inevitably, I would say, no, and I wasn't surprised last week when it was also a woman. The fact is, women have been involved in militancy since terrorism began. And even the very first trial, a terrorism trial that was held after the mayor of St. Petersburg was a failed assassination attempt. It was by a woman. So what had happened was the mayor of St. Petersburg sort of narrowly missed being killed. And Narodnaya Volia, which was a Russian group called People's Will, had been using many female operatives. And so that was, the very first trial was in 1880. So it's not surprising that women are involved. When we look at the 1960s, which is when we tend to place numerically modern terrorism, we've had women in all the different groups, right and left, a lot of the European groups. For example, Baader Meinhof was named in part after Ulrike Meinhof. So she's the woman with the cigarette. If the group is named after, or half the group is named after women, then women have a very important role. But we also saw women, for example, in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Leila Khaled became a very important symbol. What's interesting is that Leila Khaled has made a reemergence in the last year. She's been a symbol for the current Palestinian militancy that we've seen in Gaza and the West Bank. But what should be even more surprising is till this very day, there's the color picture of the woman in blue. That's Iracha Thordabal. She is the leader, obviously a woman. She's the leader of ETA, which is the Basque separatist party in Spain. So till this very day, not only are women involved in all levels of terrorism, but they might even be leaders of the group, or the group is named after them. I think what happens is, as we've shifted to these jihadi groups, that's when people have assumed that women don't play a role. And this is an example. This is a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and the various very well-known names. And you see, for example, Abdullah Azzam, who was a co-founder of Al-Qaeda, or Ahmed Yassin, who was one of the early leaders of Hamas, who was targeted assassinated by the Israelis, and a lot of different very famous Palestinian militants associated either with the Muslim Brotherhood or with Hamas. And as you can see, all men. And so that's no longer the case, though, because starting in around 2000 and, let's say, you had the very first female suicide bombers that started in Lebanon, but starting in around 2005, we started seeing jihadi groups use women bombers more and more. And so Islamic ideology had to change and shift what it said was permissible as far as women on the front lines. Now, this is a debate in Arabic about a woman's obligation. So there's this notion of jihad, and let me just take a beat for a second to explain when we talk about jihad. In Islam, there's two jihads. There is the greater jihad and the lesser or smaller jihad. Now, when Americans talk about jihad, we're talking about the holy war. Now, in Arabic and in Islam, that's the lesser. The greater jihad is the struggle, jihad, I mean struggle. It's the struggle within ourselves to be good people, to fast during Ramadan, to avoid the foods that are forbidden, to avoid alcohol, to give charity, to pray 5 times a day. That's the greater jihad. And so what tends to be largely misunderstood is that when Muslims are surveyed and they're asked, do you support jihad? If they're thinking about the greater jihad, they're going to say yes. So part of this discussion about women has been, what are women's obligations in jihad? Now, as far as the greater jihad, women's obligations are exactly the same as men. They have to fast during Ramadan, and they give alms, zakat, and they have to pray 5 times a day. And so they're doing all the same things that men do. But when it comes to the lesser jihad, jihad is holy war. That's where the debate has raged for the last 25 years about what role women should play. Now, women can be involved at all levels of terrorist organizations. They are recruiters, they raise funds, they do the logistics. We've seen them as frontline activists as well as suicide bombers. And I have a selection here, either from Bataclan or the so-called Samantha Luthwaite, the so-called White Widow, who's involved in Al-Shabaab. And so we've seen more and more of the jihadi groups, not just among the Palestinians, but among all of the jihadi groups, starting to use more and more women, not just recruiting and functioning online, but even as suicide bombers. And women are fighting on the front lines in places like Yemen and Pakistan and Iran. And what happened was, as early as 2009, women were banned from entering into a Shia shrine or a Shia mosque in Iraq, because what had happened was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was a subsidiary, wasn't the main core of Al-Qaeda that perpetrated 9/11, but it was one of the regional groups, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, began using so many women starting in 2005 that by 2009, they were banned from entering into Shia places of worship because these were mostly Sunni women. And what was interesting is that the vast majority of the suicide bombing, although sometimes American soldiers were targeted, but the suicide bombing was disproportionately used by Shia militants against, sorry, by Sunni militants against Shia targets. And so it was really targeting civilians. According to the US military, there was Lieutenant Commander David Russell. He's on the record for saying, female suicide bombers became the weapon of choice for Al-Qaeda in Iraq because women were less likely to be searched at checkpoints. And also, the women wore clothing that could conceal the suicide device, the suicide bomb. Now, we really saw, starting in 1999 with the first Chechen War, and then you had the second Chechen War, where women became part not just of the general jihadi group, but on the front lines. And in fact, as you'll notice, the picture, the black and white picture, became the cover of my book. What was interesting is the attack against the Dubrovka Theater in 2003, and then there was another attack in March of 2010. Women were front and center. Now, the 2010 attack was so fascinating because you had two female suicide bombers that were in, whose mission it was to blow up simultaneously in the Moscow subway, two different subway lines. And I mean, they blew up approximately the same time, about 25 minutes apart. But when you looked at the two women, you have on the one hand, Janette Abdurrahmanova, the woman completely covered in the niqab, and then the other one, Mariam Sharapova. You could not have had two women who were more different in terms of being suicide bombers. Now, Jeanette sort of looks the type, right? That's a stereotype. She was like 16 years old. She gets married to a jihadi. And basically, the reason she got married off to a jihadi was to transform her into a suicide bomber. Whereas Mariam Sharapova was much older. She was in her 30s. She had a master's degree. She was the headmistress of a school. And so it wasn't any kind of profile that would have completely applied to the two women. Now, when you ask yourself, why do terrorists or militant groups use women? The obvious reason is, as we mentioned with Lieutenant Commander Russell, is to avoid detection. But the other thing is, as terrorist groups move from hard targets, which is like attacking a military base or attacking soldiers or even police officers, and they moved to a softer target, which is attacking civilians at a restaurant or at a market. Women are much better at accessing the civilian target. In fact, we know that the women are able to enter into the civilian target and penetrate more deeply to the back of the bus or into the back of the room, maybe if it's a restaurant, whereas the men are more likely to be stopped at the door. When I did my field research, and I spent many years in the field interviewing terrorist leaders, and the ones that had women in the group, I would ask them, why are you using women? And this was jihadi and non-jihadi groups. They said that the women were less capable on the front lines, and so maybe they had a comparative advantage with this element of surprise that nobody would be expecting a woman. The terrorist leaders also felt that the women were more expendable. And I want to make sure that you know that this is the terrorist leaders saying this and not me. They also said that the women could be more easily manipulated, which again goes to show you that this argument that people like Andrea Dworkin would make early on, that women in terrorist groups were just an example of feminism. This is actually the opposite of feminism. This is where the terrorist leaders are saying the women don't have a utility in our society. And in fact, their utility is to be human bombs. What I also noticed, and this is true not just of that Moscow terrorist attack in March of 2010, but when it was a woman, there was so much more press and attention. And so as a result, the groups would select more attractive operatives to be female suicide bombers. This isn't to say all, for example, I have here, and this is how it came up. I put up this slide in my class years and years ago when I taught at the University of Georgia, and the students noticed that these were not unattractive women. And the reason that it became an issue was because my colleague at the University of Chicago, Robert Pape, had said the reason why women became suicide bombers was because nobody wanted to marry them. And so they became bombers because, they couldn't get a man. But in fact, many of them were married. And Reem Riashi had 2 kids. And Norma Abi Hassan, and she was one of the earlier ones from the SSNP, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party. She could have been she looks like she could have been a Revlon model. These are not unappealing women in their society. And so I personally couldn't go into the jails. There's these ethics of research and IRB that wouldn't look well on me talking to prisoners. But I had someone else ask, do you choose these pretty girls on purpose? And the leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad said, absolutely. We know that they're going to be on the cover of magazines and newspapers, and we want people to see a very pretty or attractive woman. The other thing that's really important to know is that when women are used, this has an effect of goading men into action. It makes men feel less manly. And also, when you have women, you're basically getting the children too. It's going to make the conflict appear unstoppable and multi-generational. So all of these women, except for the one in the lower right, Ahlam Tamimi, were all suicide bombers. Hanaji Jardat with the red lipstick had just finished her law degree. So it's not that they're unattractive. It's not that no one wants to marry them. They're not uneducated. They're just being in many ways manipulated by organizations that are conveying to them that the thing that the most that they can do to help their people is by being a bomber. Now, what happened was when I did my field research in Sri Lanka, and I was with the LTTE, which is the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, they used women pretending to be pregnant in order to reach a target. In 2006, Anoja Kugenthirasa was visiting Vavunya. What had happened was parts of Sri Lanka are not very developed, and the only hospital in an area might be on the base. And so they had Anoja pretending to be pregnant so that she could access the base over several weeks as if she was visiting the doctor. And it was intended so that she timed one of her visits when Sarath Fonseca was visiting so that she could kill him. And what ended up happening was she killed the driver and she killed herself. But Fonseca managed to survive the attack in 2006. What's interesting from this story is that Fonseca then was the spearhead of the campaign to completely annihilate the LTTE. He did a massive aerial bombardment campaign, which in Canada, they've wanted to accuse the Sri Lankan government of perpetrating genocide. It was a very serious campaign that killed tens of thousands of people. But from the perspective of counterterrorism, they effectively neutralized the LTTE. Had he been killed in 2006, as was the plan, the LTTE would probably still exist in Sri Lanka now. But it wasn't just in Sri Lanka. We see this, for example, in Nigeria, same thing. You have the IED, the improvised explosive device, is worn around the midsection and under loose flowing clothing gives the impression of late-term pregnancy. And as many assumptions as we have of the inherent peacefulness of women, the inherent peacefulness of a expecting mother is going to be even more persuasive, that no one's going to think about invasively like patting down a pregnant woman to make sure that the baby bump is a baby and not an IED. But we know that many of the girls who were kidnapped, and this was 10 years ago in April 2014, you may recall the Bring Back Our Girls. I mentioned it briefly in last month's talk. In Nigeria, that several of the women have been identified as suicide bombers for Boko Haram. I asked the Nigerian government, can you at least prove? I mean, there's one instance of Naomi Adamu where you could tell it's her face. But I said, can you compare? And they can't trace it because they don't have dental records and they're not doing sort of this very sophisticated CSI. So we don't know how many of the Chibok girls and women have been suicide bombers for Boko Haram. Now, men are not always very effective when they pretend to be women. There have been a number of instances at the end in Afghanistan where some of the Taliban leaders would dress up as women in order to evade capture. In November 2007, what had happened was the Iraqi soldiers at a checkpoint stopped a car that allegedly had, a bride, a groom, and members of the wedding party. And I don't know what possessed the Iraqi soldiers to ask this, but they asked the bride to take off the veil. And sure enough, Haider al-Bahdal hadn't even bothered to shave. So, I used to joke with my students, and quote Austin Powers, but it was very clearly a man. And they managed to interrupt or, preempt the suicide bombing operation. And they lifted it and they saw, 3 days of beard growth. So why do women do it? And this is why I meant that Veiled Threats is a follow-on from Bombshell many years ago. Well, in Bombshell, I introduced this idea of 5 Rs, that women were involved for redemption, revenge, respect, relationship, and what I mentioned last week, rape. And what do I mean by redemption? Is that with the early Palestinian suicide bombers, many of these women had been accused of some sort of transgression in the community. One had been accused of having an affair. One was unable to have children, so her husband left her. Maybe they wanted to exact revenge because members of their family, a boyfriend or a husband, had been killed. There was at least one perspective that the women wanted to gain the respect of their communities to show that they were just as dedicated as the men. Relationship was actually the one that's most persuasive. The best predictor of a woman's involvement in terrorism is being related to a man who's involved. And that's because the terrorist groups use different ways to make sure that they're not being infiltrated by, a fifth column or by the security forces. And so when someone joins a group and they're a family member, it's almost like it's a vetting mechanism. They're okay. It's the way people, get into sororities or, the member of their family had been a member of the fraternity or sorority. They're automatically in. Terrorist groups do the same thing. And I talked last month about why sexual violence in these very conservative communities, why sexual violence becomes a recruiting tool, so that if the women are raped, they're recruited. And if the other side isn't raping the women, they will rape them themselves. So what happened in Iraq was that American soldiers were not raping Iraqi women. And, I don't want to necessarily say that because American soldiers don't rape, but there were women American soldiers as well as male American soldiers. And so the sexual violence was occurring, but just not against Iraqi women. And so what we have is Samira Ahmed Jassim, who was a member of one of the AQI affiliates, Ansar al-Sunnah. She arranged to have 80 women of various ages raped, so that then she would pretend to be like this very caring grandmotherly figure that was giving them advice. And so what she would say is, well, you're going to have to be killed by members of your family. So maybe the best thing to do is to become a suicide bomber. And so because the women, as a result of the honor code that I mentioned last month, were facing certain death, that's how you had a massive uptick in Al-Qaeda in Iraq using female suicide bombers. It went from 4 to 60, or sort of 80 in total. But 32 of the 80 of her victims became known bombers. And we know this because a few of the women either were preempted or they changed their mind. Now, this became a feature in Al-Qaeda in Iraq propaganda. Obviously, I'm not going to read you the whole thing, and the slides are going to be available through Chai Mitzvah. But the really interesting point is our honor and chastity have been violated. Our clothes have been torn. The wombs are full of illegitimate children from rape. We scream for help to save us. I urge you, if you have weapons, attack and kill them being the Americans. I urge you by Allah. And so what was fascinating for me, because of course I'm interested in all of this, is that this is in English. And if you notice for the website, it's in the UK. When I put the slides together a few weeks ago, the website is still up. This is back from 2008. So what they were trying to convey is that women were being raped by Americans. And so if you didn't join into the jihad, wherever you were letting your sisters in Islam in Iraq and in Afghanistan get raped. And in fact, they created propaganda to argue that women in Abu Ghraib were being raped. And this is Al-Qaeda propaganda. And so on the left-hand side, they had blurred out some of the images. And I had seen this Al-Qaeda propaganda and presented it, I think at the time, to the US government. And it was during the Obama administration. Daniel Benjamin said to me, those are not American soldier uniforms. Like, they could tell from the uniforms, those were not American soldiers. And so it then led to a several-year investigation until we had more sophisticated tools. It turns out that these images that Al-Qaeda were using were from Hungarian porn. They had nothing to do with Abu Ghraib. On the right, Rawa.org was one of the platforms that Al-Qaeda used to convey this idea that women were being sexually abused if they were in American custody. And ISIS brought back the same propaganda. Starting in 2014, they started making the same argument that our sisters in Islam were being raped, and they used even the same images from the Hungarian porn. But this kind of theme that you need to protect women's honor wasn't unique to the jihadi groups or even to the Middle East. When I did my field research in Northern Ireland and I interviewed women who had been part of the provisional IRA, they talked about the strip searches and arguing that the British were humiliating Irish Catholic women in jail was a way also of recruiting men and guilting them that if they were not joining the provisional IRA, they were letting their sisters in Armagh or whatever prison be abused by the British soldiers or by the Protestant soldiers. So the argument, and this is where it's really sort of very insidious, is that they've conveyed to generations of young girls that they can do much more with their lives if they die than they can ever do if they live. And so we have instances where women said, I want to be a doctor. And the family goes, oh, Pshaw, but you could be a bomber. Now, we know in terms of Al Qaeda that women played a really important role online as recruiters. And we had, for example, Colleen LaRose, this was Jihad Jane and Jihad Jamie. They were involved in the attempt to kill Lars Vilks, who was given a death sentence because he had done some cartoons portraying the Prophet Muhammad like as a dog. LaRose is finally out of jail, and there's a really interesting RT documentary about her. She's now out of jail, and she's a Trump supporter now. So I don't quite understand how that happened, but she's had this sort of new revelation. Whereas Malika El-Arud ran a website called Minbar SOS, where she would show beheading videos and recruiting videos for bin Laden, and she just recently died. And so she was in jail for about 8 years, got out of jail and died. So that one of the things that really you'll notice is how many of the women who join the jihad are actually converts to Islam. And one of the explanations could be that as a convert, they really don't have the ballast to be able to say, that's not what jihad means. Remember, I told you the difference between the bigger jihad and the lesser jihad. So if you don't speak Arabic and you're converting to Islam and you need someone to interpret for you, if that person interpreting is trying to bastardize or distort Islam, they can, because you can't go to the text and go, yeah, but that's not what it says. Now, we have also an inaccurate media narrative about the women who joined ISIS, this idea that ISIS was luring women with kittens and Nutella. And let's go back to that picture of Janet Abdurrahmanova, one of the women who blew up in March of 2010. One of the things that happened was, and this picture would be shown on the news, and without any sense of irony, they would argue that she was radicalized by her husband Umalat's death. Christmas Eve, right before her operation in March, Umalat had been targeted by the FSB. And they would put this picture up, not realizing that the picture implies that she was kind of radicalized before Umalat died. She's sitting there with a weapon. So, I mean, I used to put this picture up and have my students guess what was wrong with the news. So the news isn't always super accurate when they're portraying women. For the most part, we've come to know many of the women who were involved in the jihad, especially in ISIS, partly because of attacks in France, or they became quite famous. Many of these women, for example, the Bethnal Green Academy girls who disappeared from London, they became very famous in part because they were so young, or they became very famous because when they tried to leave ISIS, ISIS would mysteriously explain that they had died in an aerial bombardment. So the vast majority of the women in these photos now are dead. But what ISIS did, and I know I'm running out of time soon, I'm going to have to wrap it up soon. ISIS portrayed this idea, this idealized life for women in the caliphate of sisterhood and belonging, and one, believe it or not, of female empowerment. So on one of the jihadi platforms, they were saying, well, can the sisters drive? And of course they can drive. You see, they can drive either with their gloves or their full niqab. And that was not intended for women in the West. That was being targeted for women in Saudi Arabia who were not allowed to drive. So ISIS very well understood that they had different kind of constituencies, and they tailored the messaging for each of the constituencies. And we mostly heard about the women who disappeared from Western countries. For example, they would show their Canadian or US passports. And of course, oh, we're going to burn these. And of course, these were the same women years later who were begging to get back to Canada or the United States. And if you read what ISIS said about the women in Arabic, you definitely got a sense that what ISIS expected of women was very different from the talking points that they said in English. So, for example, in the tract on the right, it says, Al Mar'a fi Adawla al Islamiyya, women of the Islamic State. And it were very clear. Now, they didn't translate, they translated everything into 25 languages for their propaganda. But Al-Mar'a fi Dawla Islamiyya, they left it in Arabic because in Arabic, they were a little bit more honest. They basically said, you may not be able to leave the house, and your purpose in coming to the Islamic State is to have babies. And a lot of what you're going to be able to do or not do will depend on what husband you get. But ISIS deliberately sought out these Western women, and especially the recruits fell into two categories of these older women who were converts and they needed some sort of reinvention. Many had a checkered past, drug abuse, other kinds of abuse, alcohol abuse. They were victimized in many ways. Some had some mental issues, or very, very young Muslim girls, because ISIS tended to elevate the women who were virginal. And so they thought that if these were Muslim girls in the West, they'd have to go very young to make sure that they were still pure. But the main purpose, and I'm just going to do this a little bit because I'm straying off topic, but the main purpose was to have kids. And this idea that you would go, not just the men would go to the training camps the way they did for Al Qaeda, in the 80s and 90s when they went to Afghanistan, but they would bring the entire family. And we really became aware starting in 2014 because ISIS began showing children in much of their propaganda. And you saw children in ISIS propaganda. For example, in 2016, they had a video called 100%, which in French means blood for blood. But also, when you say it really fast, it means 100%. So I was like, wow, that's really clever. They actually had stolen it from a French rapper. But they would show these Western kids or the foreign fighter children over and over. Here they are in 2016 in May. And then in August, the very same kids are the ones carrying out an execution. And it was ISIS that added, you see the first one, it's El Masri, he's Egyptian. And the second one is Jojo Jones. It says he's British. And then the third one, they say he's Tunisian. Like they added the nationalities of these kids to try to convey almost like United Benetton colors of ISIS. And you could watch these kids grow up. Here's Abdullah, who's, I think he's Uzbek, and you see him in 2013 with his dad. In 2014, he's in a video with, a bunch of other kids and a gun. And then by 2015, he's executing so-called Russian spies. So in essence, the women's role in ISIS, more than anything, was to have kids, but also to make sure that the men didn't leave. So, because in the early parts of the Syrian civil war, a lot of men went in 2012 or 2011 and they left. Once ISIS established this different kind of benefits, that if you came to ISIS, they gave you a wife, they gave you a free house, they gave you money for every child, like a almost jihadi welfare state. That's when you would have anchors that the men wouldn't go and come back, they would stay. And in fact, the goal was to impregnate the woman so that she would be pregnant, give birth to, the future of jihad, and then they would marry her off a few more times. I'm going to stop here and say thank you so much for your time and generosity of spirit to join us this evening. I'll stop sharing and I'll take the questions now. Okay, so the three questions so we're going to answer them live. It says, since the males who die waging jihad are promised a reward of 72 virgins, What are the women suicide bombers promised? Yeah, it's really not a good deal. The women are promised an ideal husband, but it could be the husband that they had on earth, so it's not even an upgrade. What the women are also promised are that they are able to sit by the side of the Prophet Muhammad, and if there's any physical impairments, that's taken care of. So if a woman, for example, if a woman is blind in the afterlife, she'll be able to see. If she's missing a limb, the limb grows back, but she doesn't get the 72 men. And the lack of upgrade is something. It's interesting because a lot of people think, well, if the men have 72 virgins, uh, there's a discussion about what huris mean. For some people, it's olives or raisins. And so there's a lot of different jokes that are made about the 72 virgins. But yeah, the women don't get the same benefit. Let's see. Which terrorist became a Trump supporter? So Colleen LaRose, who was known in the Philadelphia area as Jihad Jane. It was a really interesting RT documentary about her. So she was arrested by the FBI and she served time, I guess, in a supermax. And then she was released. And when she was released, it was during the Trump administration, and she like became a Trump supporter. And I just thought to myself, that is a very strange bedfellows. Are you seeing parallels in mostly pro-Hamas protesters in the US, many of whom, including the leaders, are young college-age women? You know, I'm really, really glad that you asked that question, especially since last month's talk. And again, I'm so grateful to Audrey, Nina, and Simon for letting me give that talk last month about October 7th and sort of what's going on. I think that part of it is, and we see this as well, by the way, where there's a tradition now, there's a new movement called trad wives. If you haven't heard about it, it's young women who want to have a much more conservative, traditional experience. They don't want to work, they want to be married and have kids and have a husband take care of everything. And the way in which, and this on the far right, and what's happening is that the far right groups are using women much the same way that the jihadi groups have used women to lure men, because it's one of the things that is going to get men's attention. So there's a fabulous colleague of mine, Ellie Berman. He's a professor at the University of San Diego, and he talks about, he's an economist, and he talks about the ways the different communities keep the community cohesive, and furnishing a wife and giving money to her house is one of the ways they do it. And he talks about jihadi groups, but he also talks about the Amish, and he uses as this example very from Orthodox Jews, that when you provide basic needs, it's a way of keeping that community cohesive. With the, going back to the question, because I diverted a little bit, it's a really good question. And, you know, Audrey and I were talking about it before we started. How much of this is that the women don't really understand that these jihadi groups are incredibly misogynistic? And it's for the same reason that, you know, the young women might be looking for a cause, that they want to be a part of something. You know, we have a lot of anomie and isolation that has been exacerbated both by the pandemic and by social media. We've seen a massive uptick in depression and in issues of mental health. And I'm wondering how much of this is that people have no clue about Hamas and about the way women are treated in these contexts. And so, you know, they're jumping on the bandwagon because it's a movement, and they think that this movement is like the justice protests that you had in 2020 when George Floyd was killed. So I think that it's one of the most clever things that Hamas and JVP and SJP has been able to do on college campuses is to link the pro-Hamas groups with social justice warriors and anti-colonial and anti-racism movements, when in fact Hamas is an incredibly anti-LGBT, misogynistic, racist, all of this, like, if you know anything about Hamas. So at the beginning, after October 7th happened last year, I remember a student, so I'm just going to take a sip, being interviewed at NYU by the news. And I guess the newscaster said, "Why are you here?" And the girl was like, "I don't know, just everyone was here." And I think that there's a little bit of that. I think that also, though, there's just a lot of misinformation that has been exacerbated. So I think one of the things that I also want to make clear, two things. One that I said last month, many Palestinians are opposed to Hamas. When we look at the data that's coming from Amani Jamal and the Arab Barometer and more recent surveys that have been done, Hamas, even in Gaza, has only about 6% popularity. And the other thing is that many of these groups are completely distorting Islam. And I'll give you an example. Remember how I said that the people who are converts, they don't have the Arabic language and they don't have the ballast to be able to say, "I don't think so." So there's Surat al-Tawbah 5 says, kill them wherever you find them. And when you ask them, who's the them? Oh, Christians and Jews. No, it's not. Because if you go to Surah At-Tawbah 1, so like you don't start the chapter on verse 5, but if you go to verse 1, you see that the group that they're talking about is a tribe in the Arabian Peninsula that broke a pact with Muhammad. And that's who the mushrikeen are, not Christians and Jews. And if you speak Arabic, you get to the surah where it talks about the Jews and the Christians and the Zoroastrians being people of the book and Ahl Kitab. And so, like, if you don't speak Arabic, you can't say, "Wait a second, that's not what it says." And so it's really interesting that a YouGov poll in the UK found the more you know about Islam, the less you're able to be convinced that Muhammad was okay with killing civilians, or that a lot of what the jihadi groups, which is a bastardization of Islam. Now, I want a caveat to say that I have a degree in Islamic studies, but I'm not a sheikh. I'm not an expert on Islam, but I'm expert enough to know that when they're distorting Islam, the way, some of these extreme right groups, what is it, the Baptist Church, that's God hates gays, and that they protested military, the Westboro Baptist Church. This is not Christianity either. And in the same way that Jews for Jesus is not Judaism, like, you have bastardization of different religions. And so that's why I wanted to make that distinction between the lesser jihad and the major jihad.
Amia, I want to ask you also to reflect on not only the bastardization of the religion, but the quandary that even in Judaism, where you have, let's say, a mechitza, and you have a situation, a separation of men and women, and for the Orthodox Jewish community, they'll say, this is not sexist. This is men and women have different roles, and this is not misogynistic. This is the way it is. It is in traditional Jewish communities, and so I think we have a number of different themes running through all of this. So it seems to me that any any separation or any differentiation of roles can be bastardized and can be made to look or made into something terrible and nefarious, when in other situations it can be very beautiful and life affirming. And I think we have this tendency to put on cultures that are different than the mainstream American women's rights and women have worked so hard to have equal access to jobs and salary and all kinds of things, and then to be in a situation where you're in a synagogue and you're separated from the men and you're not allowed to do things, and that is not necessarily misogynistic. So I don't know if I'm being if I'm articulating this, but I think there's so many different strands to this. And there's a tipping point where that it becomes something that's nefarious. It doesn't necessarily have to be nefarious.
I think the hypersegregation of genders is maybe problematic because women become responsible in their clothing for men's inability to control themselves. And I think that that's why the mechitza exists in certain, the Orthodox, but not in Reform and Reconstruction. Whereas for me, the misogyny that you detect in, let's say, because so you have Sunni and Shia, and within the Shia there's like 6 different kinds of Shia, but even within Sunni you have 4 schools of juridical thought, and within these 4 schools of fiqh, of jurisprudence, not all are the same level of strictness. But the idea that women would be blamed for being raped, or the idea that women have to be like, you can't in Afghanistan, that the Taliban have just, you can't hear a woman's voice, or a woman can't laugh or sing. I mean, this is taking hypersegregation to an extreme. And especially when you have in Pashtunwali culture where abuse of children, especially of male children, apparently there's a horrific saying that women are for children and boys are for love. I mean, there's another time we can talk about Bachabazi, which is a tradition, the dancing boys of Afghanistan. But it's really horrific when you look and a woman who is sexually exploited or raped, she's being blamed for being raped. And so she either has to marry the rapist, which in cases of foreign militaries raping the women, that's not an option, or she has to be killed by members of her own family to take away the stigma. And for me, that is a misogyny. That's not just a segregation during prayer. But I think that this idea of obligation, I think so many people interpret it differently. I never saw a female rabbi until I moved to the States because, and my friend Dina is in the audience, but we went to Talmud Torah, which was a fairly modern Orthodox school. All the rabbis were male, and nobody thought, women wanted to wear a kippah or tzitzis or anything. So I think that we're changing, and with every different interpretation of Judaism, as with Islam, the role for women changes. I don't know if there's female sheikhs in any of the interpretations yet, but it's certainly, I do have a lot of problems. I don't have a problem with a veil if it's the woman's choice. If
Yes,
wearing
that's what I
a
was going
veil
to ask.
allows a woman access into spaces where no one's going to question, oh, she's going to school and no one's going to say anything bad about her. But, there's certain things that I'm absolutely opposed to, like female genital mutilation, where they're actually cutting parts of women. No, I'm not American, I'm Canadian. I don't know if can't hear the accent anymore. There's one last question I want to make sure I get to that one. The women and children is very interesting. The women don't train in the camps. The women, we know very little about the training. The training is not as extensive. And so the women were trained very quickly to okay, carry this bomb. So, when I was younger, we used to have this saying, we will sell no wine before it's time. Remember the gallows saying? So if you have a quick bomber, you have a bad bomber. A lot of the women got caught because they weren't trained at the same level. Now in Sri Lanka, they're trained. So you have women cadres of the LTTE. They have their own units and they have their own leadership. And so that's where the women have exact same training, and they're very effective. Now with Boko Haram, we don't know a lot, but they were being trained. Some of them were being trained in Sambisa. And some of the women that I interviewed for the book, they basically they volunteered for a suicide operation because they figured it'll get me out of the forest, and then I can accidentally on purpose get caught, and this is a way that they got to live. So it's really interesting because what we know from Boko Haram and Bring Back Our Girls and the trending hashtag is only a fraction of what was really going on behind the scenes with women in Boko Haram.
Okay, we just have a few seconds. Mia, is there anything else you'd like to leave us with that you haven't been able to speak about tonight?
I think, from my perspective, the most important thing for women who are in the Islamic world is to have really good sources of emulation, and that these sources not be the female bombers, that the female bombers become like they're rock stars. And I think that's a problem. I think telling little girls that their usefulness is most like is greatest in their death than in their life is the problem. I think we want to encourage, because the thing is, even in hyper segregated societies, you're going to need to have women doctors, you're going to need to have women in all levels. So empowering these young women instead of telling them you could do more with your death than you could ever do with your life would be the way to go. But the last thing is from I spent years going back and forth to Pakistan to these kids who were these were boys being rehabilitated. They'd been kidnapped by the Taliban, or their families had given them over or sold them to the Taliban. And that any child you can rehabilitate any child. No child is a lost cause. And so when we're looking at the situation now facing the US and Canada and the UK and other countries, do we let them back? My position is let the women and the children back. If the women have perpetrated crimes, put them in jail. But leaving them in Syria, in Al Hol and Al Roj, it's a ticking time bomb. Because at some point, the Kurds are going to be sick and tired of watching over them. And they're going to close the camps, and the people are going to go into the wind. At least if the countries let the women and children back, they can watch them and they can rehabilitate the kids, and they can give them whatever they need in terms of psychosocial treatments to have a happy and normal life. And so that's sort of my last, maybe a happy ending for a very depressing talk.
So interesting. Thank you so much. So much to unpack here, so much to think about. So we'll hear from you again in January, right? December. Okay.
December, I'm going to talk about the QAnon conspiracy and anti-Semitism.
Great. Okay. Something less depressing, perhaps. I don't know. But thank you for your insightful presentation tonight. Our next Scholar Circle features Dr. Sofia Moskalenko. The topic will be From Vulnerability to Violence, the Pathways to Radicalization. Please join us on Monday, November 18th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Bloom, and we hope to see you all again on Monday, November 18th in the daytime at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, thank you so much. Be well.
Bye.